All right, welcome everyone to episode 41 of APS Radio. My name is Jim Bernick, and once again, I'm joined with Brian Daboul. Good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So I'm glad you're on here. We're going to talk about some pretty exciting stuff for the fire service. I guess it's going to be dependent on if you're who you are, if you're excited about it or not. But this has been some big news lately, and I know we're going to kind of do a deep dive into the stuff, but we're going to talk about the new OSHA Emergency Response Standard. So before we even get into that, I think it's important to really talk about the history of how this came to be. So I tag you in, Brian. Take it from here.
So, as far as the history goes, right now, OSHA doesn't have a specific firefighter standard or something targeting firefighters. They have what's called the fire brigade standard. And the fire brigade standard was written in the 80s, and it was targeted at private fire brigades or private entities such as industrial fire brigades. So when you look at what's in that text of that regulation, it's actually extremely outdated. The stuff it references for personal protective equipment is gear that we haven't used in a long time. Um, the current fire service can't comply with that regulation the way it's written because it wasn't written with the goal of targeting like a public fire department. Again, it was for private industry. So the fire service currently tries to comply with a web of different OSHA standards. So, for example, like the HAZCOM standard, the respiratory protection standard, we're constantly trying to find stuff in different places. So, this new proposed standard is going to eliminate the fire brigade standard as it stands in 1910.156. It's going to completely replace it with what they're going to call emergency response. And that's going to apply to both the private industry fire brigades and then also what they call ESOs or emergency service organizations, which would be your fire, EMS, technical rescue teams, all the stuff that we're currently talking about. So this new standard is going to basically split the standard to hit both of those. Um, it's aimed right now, so it's currently in comment period. So I believe we're going to see something significant on this in 2025.
Do you think that's when it's actually going to go live?
Yeah, just my opinion is the way they're pushing it. I think you'll see something by the end of 25. I might be surprised. It might take them a little longer. They've extended the comment period twice now, so now we're at July 22nd for the comment period to end. But I also for the states that are in a state-run OSHA plan, for example, I'm in New Jersey, we have PIOSH. They have to adopt those regulations as well, which they're going to be required to, but that may also slightly extend the time before it becomes effective in those states.
I follow you. Now, could you kind of explain the difference between this OSHA standard, OSHA regulation versus an NFPA standard?
So an NFPA standard is industry best practice. So it's what we call a consensus standard. It aims to outline what everybody should be doing, but it is not technically a law. An OSHA standard or regulation is actually a law that you can be held to. There's financial penalty for not following it. It can be enforced by OSHA or whoever your state agency plan is, like PIOSH or Cal OSHA, depending on what state you're in. Um, the problem is with this new proposal is they're incorporating, I believe it's 22 NFPA standards by reference. And when OSHA incorporates a consensus standard by reference, they're essentially saying, we love the context of this. We don't need to rewrite it. We just want to adopt it by reference and make the entire context of that document now part of the OSHA regulation. So they can put a one-liner saying we're going to incorporate NFPA 1001, for example, by reference, and that now makes the entire text of that standard an OSHA regulation. They're saying they're looking, I believe, again, the number was 22, to incorporate 22 by reference. The problem is they're also in the middle of this NFPA consolidation project. So they're taking, I believe it was 114 standards and bringing it down to 38 overarching standards for emergency responders. While that's good and streamlines where you can find things, and everybody's got to get used to where those new numbers are. For like example, NFPA 1500, which was your safety program, is now going to be 1550, and it's combined with command safety and the qualifications for incident safety officers and health and safety officers. So what was previously 3 standards will now be 1550 with chapters within it. While that's great, NFPA is not done with that consolidation project until I believe the end of 25. So OSHA's saying these are the 22 that we want to incorporate by reference, but we're going to reference the consolidation standards once we put this final law out. So it will be less than 22, but again, it's just all moving parts. So we're trying to, it's trying to hit a moving target. In addition to that complication, a lot of people aren't able to comply with NFPA standards in their entirety because they are much more complex than typically what OSHA would put together. One of the things I saw as a recommendation, I believe his name was Dave Deniston out of New York. He was recommending that they take the context of the NFPA standards that they wish to incorporate and physically write it into the OSHA standard so that they're not incorporating the entire NFPA standard. And also it's much easier then to change things because, we had a conversation prior to this. The NFPA standards update much quicker than the OSHA standards do. And an NFPA standard is on, I believe, a 3-year cycle, whereas OSHA, for them to incorporate a new rule like they are right now, this has been going on since 2007 with their subcommittees and their investigation and their background investigations and pulling together data and drafting the proposed rule. So they will never be able to keep up with the NFPA standard revisions. So if they were to incorporate something right now that's, let's say, a 2023 NFPA standard, when it updates in 2026, they're not going to go back and change the OSHA regulations. It's just not going to be compatible. So I do agree it'd be better if they take the context and put it into their own words.
So, and when these standards come out, when these updated NFPA standards, I should say, come out, very quickly, this new OSHA regulation is going to be outdated.
Correct.
I mean, and it's they're putting all this work into it, but as we're going to advance because things are more timely with NFPA, this is just going to, be the same problem that we have right now.
Well, and the other thing people have issue with as far as the incorporation of the NFPA standards by reference is NFPA is a private entity. They charge for their standards. Yes, there's free access. The free access is terrible to try to read. You got to zoom in on this little screen. You can buy NFPA link access for, I think it's $100 a year, or you can purchase the standards for a couple $100 a piece in print. An OSHA regulation is public record. You can print it all day long, have access to it, whereas now you have to pay for these NFPA standards, which in addition to all these items that we're going to have to comply with, which I'm sure we're going to talk about shortly, now you add the cost of having to even pay for the regulation text just to have it on hand.
Yeah, that's, what? You should run a show because that was a good segue. Let's actually talk about what some of these, this new OSHA regulation is trying to get accomplished.
So there's a lot to it.
How many pages, by the way? I should ask that.
So that's a good question. The proposal that came out, 608 pages. And even I was like, oh, crap, I got to read all this. I started reading it all and realized how much fluff is within there. There's only about 40 to 60 pages that you really need to care about, which is the draft proposed text. Everything else is explanation of what they want done and what they're expecting and all their background on why they're doing this and case studies. And I mean, yes, it's all value added, but for the common person just trying to figure out how to comply, they don't need 608 pages. So it's about 40 to 60 pages of actual text, which is still a lot. It starts really with the definitions, like any other OSHA standard, where they outline the difference between what they're calling a WERT, a workplace emergency response team, and an ESO, the emergency service organization. So for the purpose of a fire department, a first aid squad, an EMS provider, or technical rescue team, we are what's called an ESO, an emergency service organization. Now, when you start reading through the text, you'll see why that's important because it's constantly referring to what a WERT has to do and what an ESO has to do. Um, the first thing is you really need to establish a community risk assessment, which is something that most departments don't do, especially volunteer departments all over the country. So NFPA 1300 actually outlines recommendations on how to complete a community risk assessment. Uh, you don't have to follow NFP 1300. That's not being incorporated by reference. That's not one of those 22, but it's a good resource. Once that community risk assessment is done, the information within that is then going to be used for you to decide your level of service. So what I mean by that is not every fire department does everything, but they want you to actually outline in writing what your level of service is going to be. So for example, my fire department in Mine Hill, New Jersey, we are fire suppression. We do tender operations because we have a water tender, and we also do vehicle rescue and low angle rope. Aside from that, everything else we sub out to mutual aid. So they want you to spell that out in writing. Once you spell that out in writing, you have to use that level of service to create an emergency response plan. That emergency response plan, again, has to be a written document. There's a lot of stuff that has to be incorporated within that. I don't want to get too into the details. Once you conduct your emergency response plan, which has to include all different levels of responders. It can't just be something the chiefs draft up. It has to include firefighters, and there has to be employee involvement. Uh, the next thing is a risk management plan. So now they want a written risk management plan outlining within all those tasks you're going to do: emergency operations, non-emergency operations, vehicle operations. They essentially pulled the RMP stuff right out of NFPA 1500. They want you to outline all the items that can go wrong, all the risks that you have, identify the severity and the probability, and then assign a risk score to those, to which ones you're going to address first, and then also how you're going to address those. So whether you're going to eliminate something, use PPE to fix an issue, have a program in place to educate people, that all is going to be in your risk management plan. On top of the risk management plan, they now want you to have an SOP for, and the way they worded was for each situation you reasonably can expect to encounter. So that leaves it very wide open to interpretation, where, if you're going to be responding to high-rise fires, for example, versus somebody that's in the middle of a farm in Iowa, you're not going to need that SOP. There is a list of specific SOPs they're looking for, such as highway operations, gross decon, vehicle operations. So they do spell out certain ones that specifically are required in addition to that generalized requirement. And then on top of that, within certain SOPs, they also require specific items. So for example, the vehicle operations SOP, they want to know how you're handling personally owned vehicles, if you're allowing them to respond to the scene, and if so, what the limitations are. And then on top of that, they want to know for backing of vehicles, whether you're going to use a spotter, you're going to have a backup camera, or you're going to have the operator get out and do a walk around. So they specifically require one of those items. So while you do have a lot of leeway with how you write your SOPs, there are specific ones that you have specific requirements for. In addition to the SOPs, there's a whole section: command safety, incident safety. I think one of the biggest items that I take issue with is what they call control zones. So I get the overall point of it, but they want you to now have physical barriers, either with cones, tape, or barricades, for a hot zone, warm zone, cold zone, and also a no entry zone. For example, if there was a down power line or something. A common structure fire, to be able to do all those zones with physical barriers, is at least a one-person, if not a two-person job, on top of needing all those supplies. I just don't think it's feasible. I don't see it being done effectively or within the first stage of the incident. I think we need to come up with other ways to control entry and other ways to control resources. They're trying to eliminate freelancing, which is great, but I just don't think that that portion is feasible. Another big section, which I'll turn back over to you in a minute, Jim. I feel like I'm talking too much.
No,
The
no, this is your area. I mean, you're the subject matter expert at this. So yeah, do your thing.
medical requirements. So there's a bunch of sections within medical requirements. They want a medical surveillance program where you need to have some level of ongoing medical evaluation at minimum every 2 years. Where it gets more complicated and expensive is they say you have to track exposures, which I don't take issue with. I think it's great. It kind of ties back to our conversation we had about the autotoxic chemical article that I wrote, that you need to have some sort of documentation of your exposures to be able to go back and show later on that it's a workplace issue that you're having. So, for example, you have hearing loss, you can show all those exposures to byproducts of combustion. So that's great. We're going to start tracking every time we're exposed to combustion, has to go in the medical file of each responder. But once you hit what they're right now calling the threshold of 15 exposures a year, and they say that's without regard for respiratory protection. So even if you're using SCBA and walk into a smoke-filled environment, that is considered an exposure because of the absorption through your skin, your gear. You have to track each of those exposures. And once you hit 15 per year, as the current text stands, you now need to have that medical exam every 2 years be the equivalent at minimum of NFPA 1582, which I know you happen to be on the technical committee for. So maybe you can give the listeners a background on what that involves and what it costs.
It's going to be dependent um, on who's doing your physicals, and also to what, because there's the minimum standard for that for 82, which is going to be 1580. But at the same time, there's a lot of places that add extra screenings as well. But typically, best best guess estimate for an FPA physical is around $750. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that. Sometimes I've seen also where people can use their insurance and get a lot of the screenings done, including in their insurance annual physical. That's usually free. So, and it's just the extra stuff that costs a little bit more. So, but typically for the department, $750. Now, I can see where you're going with this, where if you have a smaller rural department that just doesn't have a budget, their budget is basically to pay for, fuel for the year and a little bit more. And now, you're given $750 that you really weren't counting for per member every 2 years. I wonder, is that 15? Does that include training fires too?
So yes, the way it's written currently, that would include exposure to any byproduct combustion. So it's structure fires, vehicle fires, you get a dumpster on fire, a trash can on fire, a brush fire. You pull up to unattended cooking, and it's the house is full of smoke. They're actually saying, if you look at some of the studies, that smoke from unattended cooking is more
Yeah.
hazardous than a structure fire because of some of the things like Teflon coatings, and um, so it's very easy to hit that number. One of the things I did see, and again, the current text is a proposal, so it can change. Um, I don't, I'll address that for a second. Everybody says, well, let's all make comments and get this knocked down. It's not going away. It's going to be very similar to the way it's written right now, just with some minor alterations depending on the comments. One of the items that OSHA specifically asks for comments on is that threshold of 15. So they want to know, is that the right number? Is that too high? Is that too low? I, in my opinion, feel that that's too low when you're taking into account everything, such as like a trash can on fire. If it was structure fires only, yes, that's a good number. Um, I think the number should be a little higher when it's all inclusive like that, especially because one of the other items that they're going to require now is gross decon, which is going to be a huge change, I know, in my area. And what I mean by that is when you walk out of a fire, before you take your SCBA off, they're expecting that you're going to do gross decon of those guys to get the contaminants off of their gear. And just simple wet gross decon is shown to eliminate contaminants somewhere between 80 to 85%. In the colder months, there are methods to be able to do dry decon, which still eliminates it up to 20%. Uh, and then in addition to that gross decon, they no longer want contaminated gear in the cab of the truck, which is also another thing that we have to figure out. So a lot of departments do not have two sets of gear for their guys. Uh, they're reusing gear. They do clean it periodically, but for us, I don't know how we're going to be able to not put that gear in the cab. We don't have somewhere else for it. And then when we get back to the station, in that time that we need to clean that gear and have it out of service, what are those guys using? Because a set of PPE for us, structural turnout gear, is approximately $5,000 for what we use. So for us to do two sets of gear for everybody is just not feasible. In addition to those two sets of gear, one of the NFPA standards they're incorporating by reference is the one that covers structural turnout gear. I don't remember the number off the top of my head right now, but that limits gear to 10 years. So a lot of departments that use gear longer than 10 years, especially rural departments that don't get a lot of use out of it, after 10 years, it's still in great shape. They're going to be required to replace it every 10 years. So if you have even 10 guys, you have to be doing a set a year at minimum.
This whole regulation is it's a weird dynamic. I imagine because you're going to have really two different mindsets. I think you have management, you have the bean counters that are not going to like this because it costs money. And I think ultimately, when you look at the fire service, the firefighters, I think, although I could see, I mean, I'm a guy that doesn't necessarily like rules, but I can also say that this is really for our benefit. All these, changes is really just supporting us and the job that we do so we can do our job a little bit more safely and also have a better chance of making it home and sticking around for a while.
So, a few things on that. In the words of many others that I've heard, we cannot come out against safety as a fire service. We can't just say this needs to go away, and it's not going to go away. We have needed a lot of these changes for a long time. I just feel like it's way too much at once. There is phase-in period, so like your community risk assessment, I believe, is to be done within 2 months of the rule being put into effect versus the last items you have up to 24 months. There is about 2 years where you can get this done. Uh, I think they should make the windows a little bit longer for certain items just to allow for that phase in. But also, what I find odd is that everybody always there's the argument of you know career versus volunteer. We're all the same. We're all professionals. We all go through the same training. But now I hear, well, maybe we should have lower requirements for volunteers. The fire does not discriminate. The cancer does not discriminate. So it's now not the time to try to backpedal and play that game. So we are all going to be in the same boat. There's not going to be differentiation between volunteer and career. Um, we need to start getting this stuff done now. So one of the things that I've done in my area, I don't know if I told you, I started a company, BGD Safety and Compliance, where I do consulting on the side. And it was originally intended for general industry, but I've actually done more in the fire service lately than in general industry. I put together a class, it was 150 slides on this entire proposed regulation. I've done that class about 4 different times in my area. I have another one coming up in July for another group. And I go over soup to nuts, kind of what we already have to comply with and what this new proposed regulation is bringing into place. So my goal is to try to get people working on this now. Start putting your SOPs together that you're missing, start doing your community risk assessment, start doing the things that aren't going away and that are good practice, And then last minute, when they put the rule into effect, we see what the requirements are for the medical portion and the additional training. One of the things that we didn't talk about yet was the additional training requirements. So moving forward, all structural firefighters have to be trained to the operations level for rapid intervention. So right now it's NFPA 1407. That's being incorporated into a new standard. I don't remember the number. So we now need to get all interior firefighters trained on those skills. Another big change, apparatus operators have to be compliant with 1002, which will now be part of 1010. It'll be a chapter of 1010. So that outlines specific items that each apparatus operator has to do based on the type of apparatus, and that needs to be documented. As far as training goes for officers, we have to comply with NFPA 1021, which specifically requires like fire instructor and firefighter 2 to be able to even get your fire officer level 1 credential. So there's a lot of prerequisites hidden within that text. On top of those training and credentialing requirements, there's annual skills checks. So everything from, you need to be able to do forcible entry, ventilation, hose lines, hydrant hookup. You have to do a skills check every year, has to be documented. And then there's also, going back to the beginning of this, they want you to set up tiers of members. So you're going to say, this guy's an apparatus operator only. Here's what he has to be able to do. Here, this guy's going to be an interior firefighter. This guy's going to be a vehicle rescue technician. So they almost want you to create job descriptions. And within each one, there has to be minimum medical requirements, physical performance requirements, and you're going to be expected to hold them to those. So if you get a guy who starts getting real out of shape and can't throw a ladder anymore, they actually say you're supposed to have a reconditioning program, I'm probably not using the right word, where you can get him back into doing what he's supposed to do when he fails that performance evaluation. That kind of ties back into the medical items. So I know we talked about the 1582 exam before, but there's other components to the medical section. So behavioral health and wellness, big thing. You just came out with your book. So they want an entire behavioral health and wellness program where you have resources available at no cost within the community or at unlimited access to your responders. So again, that's going to be a cost where we need to have some sort of agreement that, hey, I say I need some help. I go to this guy that's the predetermined provider. I don't have to tell my employer, and the employer is going to get a bill for whatever the services are. So we have to have that set up ahead of time.
Is that different than an EAP?
What do you mean by EAP?
Employee Assistance Program?
It could be part of an EAP, but it has to meet the credentials or the requirements outlined in this text. So they have to be able to offer certain types of services.
Okay.
It would work if you have a good EAP. It would be fine. There's a requirement within the text that you have to talk about those services regularly and after every catastrophic event. So you have a firefighter fatality, you have a civilian fatality where it's traumatic to the crew. You have to be reminding them of these resources. In addition to, so we talked about the medical evaluations, we talked about the behavioral health portions. They also have what they call a health and fitness program they want you to have, where you're evaluating at minimum every 3 years against 4 criteria. So it's cardiovascular endurance, cardiovascular endurance, flexibility and mobility, and I can't think right now. There's four items there, regardless. So you have to evaluate the guys against those, and then show every 3 years whether there's a improvement or a decline, and kind of coach them to improve their fitness within this fire service. Doesn't specifically outline pass or fail criteria, but there are those evaluations where that's going to tie into their medical evaluations. If their doctor sees that they're going downhill, they can increase the requirement to annually from every 2 years. They can include specific additional screenings they have to go through. It gives a lot of power back to the physician to control who is allowed to operate within the fire service, who's not.
Interesting. You know, some of the other stuff that I heard too was regarding the two in and two out. Could you kind of elaborate on that kind of discussion?
So from what I've read and seen, the two in two out rule is currently under 1910.134, which is the respiratory protection standard. If you're familiar with it, there's a specific area that refers to structural firefighting activities. So it says in there that you need, for every IDLH environment, two out for every that you have two in. Um, when when you read this new proposal, so they're going to take that section out of the respiratory protection standard and place it into this new standard. So it's, from my understanding, going to remain the same. But everybody's asking the question, who is the two out? Who qualifies as the two out?
Mm,
The two out has to be able to enter that environment to make a rescue of those firefighters. They have to be SCBA certified. They have to be able to do everything the interior guys do. An apparatus operator or an incident commander does qualify to be those two out, given that they meet those requirements. You also cannot adversely affect the incident by incorporating those two out. So if putting those two to work would screw up the entire incident, then they frown upon that. They do actually require within your SOPs that you have an SOP for when you have an event such as an entrapment where you get there, you may not have two in, two out, and you're going to violate that rule. So they allow you to violate two in, two out only for a life hazard. Uh, the other thing that they say is within your emergency response plan, they want you to outline what can you safely do with the guys you have on scene and how you're going to operate in that manner. And what I mean by that is if you look at NFPA 1710, 1720, they outline, one's for volunteer and one's for career departments, what the standard is for manpower responding to a scene. So the volunteer side, they specifically say you just need to get X amount of people to the scene. And I believe the number is like 16 or 17 for a typical residential structure fire. They say
yeah.
that's what you need to effectively handle that single family dwelling. You can accomplish that number through mutual aid. It doesn't mean you need to roll up with 16 guys. But what they're asking is that within your emergency response plan and in your operations, if you get there and you have your four guys, you say, okay, what can I do safely and effectively? So I'm going to put a hose line to operation, do fire suppression. I have my two in, two out, two guys on a hose line. You can safely do that one task. And as guys roll in, you can start rolling them into search, into ventilation, into secondary hose lines, however you're going to do it. But they don't want you to try to do 10 tasks with those 2 to 4 guys. So OSHA is not specifying minimum staffing levels. That was one of the things that came up. They are not telling you you can't roll out the door with X amount of people or you need a minimum on the engine. They're just telling you set up what your standard is. Hey, I need 16 people for this fire. When I roll up, here's how many people to do each task and how I'm going to safely perform a task and build on that operation as I get more guys.
Yeah, I follow you. Um, I know it's pretty easy to find who is, on the technical committees for NFPA standards, but who are the ones that are actually writing all this OSHA regulations?
So I'm not 100% sure who the specific people are that wrote it. They have a committee. Um, they do have to have small business representation, so it's called SABRIFA. They've had all those committee meetings for input. Like I said, this started back in 2007, and it started with requests for information where they went out to certain groups. I wish I had known about it back then. I would have gotten involved, but those things were always kind of quiet until now it blows up into this proposed regulation.
You were still in high school back in like 2007.
I don't know what you're talking about. You're right. I was a junior in high school. Um, they started with these requests for information, and then they went through all their committees and came out with this proposed rule. As far as I'm aware, they had representation from the fire service, different groups like the IAFF, National Volunteer Fire Council. There's, don't quote me on that, but they had different groups such as those that were involved. Um, from my understanding, the way that it went was they threw out some ideas and some questions. Hey, what do we need to do with this, with that? People gave input. People agreed something needed to be done, and then they put this text together, which is very expansive. Those groups that were involved didn't necessarily have control over the text. That comes down to OSHA's staff. Like I said, I think they need to retake a look at some of the timelines for implementation, and they also need to take a look at those NFPA standards and physically putting some of the text into the OSHA standard or the OSHA regulation versus just incorporating by reference, which makes the text massive that we need to comply with. Um, it's going to be a lot. I have to say I do enjoy doing this kind of stuff. So it's I've been working on it for our department for a while. We're going to be way ahead of the ball game because I'm working on it now. But a lot of people are waiting for the text to come out, and as soon as that stuff becomes law, some of the windows are 2 to 6 months for some of these initial documents, and they're going to struggle to get it done.
Is there anywhere in there where it's saying every department needs a wellness coordinator?
So funny enough, in multiple of these programs, you need a specific coordinator. So your respiratory protection program has to have an assigned coordinator. Your safety program for the entire department needs to have a health and safety officer, which is the coordinator. For your health and fitness program, you need to have an assigned coordinator. So that is really what you're referring to as the wellness coordinator, because within that, they also require, we didn't talk about this before, that you are to either provide training or material or education in some manner on health and fitness activities such as weight management and proper diet and sleep habits and
That's
smoking cessation. And they want all this material in front of everybody. And honestly, I'm a safety guy. I'm great with a lot of this stuff, but I found a guy within my department who him and his wife are health fanatics. And I said, you're going to manage this. Do you just tell me what to do? But I'm not doing that. I have no idea. I mean, I'm not, you know,
I'm just
exactly how to go to the
I
gym every.
selfishly asked that question so I can get my resume ready for send it to like Hawaii County and stuff like that.
It's a good retirement job. You move wherever you want.
Yeah. No, sweet. I know we mentioned earlier that the comments have been pushed back a couple times now, and you're actually able to have a public comment up to July 22nd.
Right.
And I'll make sure to put that link in the info of that I do for all the podcasts, so in a text. And but is there anything else of significance that we need to talk about regarding this? Or I know we covered a lot in a pretty short amount of time.
Yeah. So, like I said, I'm talking in generalized terms because there's a lot. That's why that class that I've been offering is 150 slides just to get into the details. What I would tell everybody is go to that proposed standard, pull out that 40 to 60 pages of actual text, read it multiple times, and think about how it applies to your organization, and maybe highlight the things you're already doing, and then with a different color highlight the things that you need to do, and then it allows you to focus more on the gaps of what you're currently not doing. um, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have anybody within the department that has the time to dedicate to this, you need to hire help. You need to start talking to your councilman, your commissioners, whoever holds the key to the money. You need to start talking to them now, because you're going to spend money on your NFPA standards, getting copies of those, your medical surveillance, whatever equipment you need, and also consulting help. Again, I always tell everybody this isn't a sales call. Use who you want, but that's what I do for a living. You need somebody that can help guide you through this process and help you with the things you can't do. Do what you can on your own, and hire somebody to do the things you can't. so you can pick your battles when it comes to money. And if you have a fire department in a town that has 6 districts, let's say, and 2 EMS squads, you don't all need to do your own community risk assessment, for example. It's the same community. You can do one and share that amongst all those agencies. So, you can try to reduce your costs in your operation in that manner.
No, good stuff, man. I appreciate you joining me again. I know it was just a couple months ago, but you keep bringing it, so I'm gonna keep having you back on.
No, I enjoy it. Thank you.
Yeah. So my name is Jim, and he is Brian, and I'm sure we'll talk again about this as it keeps we learn more and more about it and how it actually is really going to look. That's when these comments are done and what the finished product will actually mean for everybody.
Yeah, hopefully they narrow it down a little bit in their final review.
Yeah. Instead of 600 pages, it's 599. No, I'm just kidding. No, but no. He's Brian, I'm Jim. I know he's got another meeting to get to, and I'm gonna really start my day. So until next time, my friend, take care.
Yeah, you too.